The Russian campaign was so extensive, and compared to other campaigns of World War II, so long that it is impossible to give a complete picture of the Abwehr's activities in it. Nevertheless, the following incidents should give a fairly comprehensive picture of the problems faced by the German intelligence service on the Eastern Front and how they were dealt with. Intelligence work against Soviet Russia was very difficult, if only because of the lack of a common border. Beyond this, however, was the fact that all commercial relations with foreign countries were conducted on the Soviet side exclusively by state organizations, with the result that there was very little travel both to and from the foreign world, and therefore it was simply impossible to send itinerant agents to the Soviet Union. German businessmen were given access to certain parts of the Union in the 1920s, when the Russians were still making trade concessions and using German aid to rebuild their industry and agriculture. But these businessmen, with very few exceptions, refused on principle any cooperation with the intelligence service. The probe of the Red Army by the Abwehr in the 1920s did not have the importance attached by the Wehrmacht to espionage against the Polish army. The Soviet Union was not categorized as a potential enemy at all. On the contrary, friendly relations and mutual exchange of information were the order of the day. The heavy armaments denied to Germany under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles could be easily manufactured in the Soviet Union, and since the Germans had contributed much from their experience in World War I to the production and improvement of these armaments, they were quite well aware of the modern armaments of the Soviet land and air forces and of the strength and structure of the Red Army. As for the Navy, the intelligence service, by its meticulous attention to detail, was able to build up quite a multifaceted picture of the Red Fleet and its bases. I do not believe, however, that there was any large-scale infiltration of the Red Army or the Red Fleet by German agents, as was alleged during the trial of Marshal Tukhachevsky and other leaders of the Soviet armed forces in the Great Repression of the mid-1930s. Although I myself was not in the Abwehr at the time, I am of the opinion that the fantastic accusations of treachery made by Soviet public prosecutors were groundless. How difficult it was to conduct intelligence in Russia became clear to the Germans by examining the archives of the Polish intelligence service, which fell into German hands at the end of the campaign in Poland. Although Poland had a long land border with the Soviet Union, the information collected by the Poles was in fact no more comprehensive than that available to the Germans. But as soon as the German and Soviet forces came face to face after the conclusion of the Polish campaign, the task of intelligence regarding the Red Army was immediately placed in the hands of German and many former Polish agents, now working for the Abwehr. And when war with Russia broke out in June 1941, the distribution, armament and ammunition of the Soviet troops, and the location of their airfields, at least in the part of Poland they occupied, were known with comparative accuracy. This intelligence achievement was all the more remarkable when one considers that the Russians were doing everything possible to prevent any penetration into Soviet territory. Wherever there was a land border, they immediately erected barrier structures. A barbed wire fence was placed in front. Behind it a 10 to 15-yard wide control and trace strip was cleared, ploughed and raked so that any trace of passage was sure to remain. At regular intervals listening posts were erected, and the wire line was mottled along its entire length with a variety of alarms, most of which, it must be confessed, were of a primitive character. Behind this barrier ran a belt of security about 20 miles wide. A certain part of this border area was cleared of all inhabitants, and in the rest, the inhabitants were forbidden to give shelter to outsiders. In the advanced bases of the Abwehr, great demands were made on the equipment of the agents. Only those persons were considered for use as agents who naturally had a good command of the language and whose appearance was in no way suspicious. They had to be dressed in appropriate clothing, and appearance did not end with appearance. Underwear, shoes, matches, cigarettes, tobacco, all of the right kind, had to be provided, and even a single button that looked Western could be a source of great danger. The most difficult of all tasks, however, was the supply of documents. It was not simply a question of issuing the necessary credentials. Every agent had to be supplied with passes, confirming both his right to be in any area he happened to pass through and his right to enter the area to which he was ultimately traveling. Before the campaign began in June 1941, the Abwehr had established the presence of 77 Soviet infantry divisions on Polish territory, a figure which the Foreign Armies Division of the Army General Command questioned at the time, but which later proved to be correct. The organization originally established by the ABWEA for the previous campaigns was expanded for the Russian campaign, and one or more commando groups were attached to each army group. In addition to the ABWEA branches themselves set up to infiltrate the Soviet Union, there was another source of information: the Russian emigre colony, those countless Russian officers and civilians who had flocked to the West after the revolution, most of them settled in France. But in the 1920s and 1930s, there were also many Russians in Berlin who were struggling to adapt to the German way of life and trying diligently to fit into the German economy. Many of the former officers had no knowledge of anything other than what their military careers had taught them. Some of them managed to maintain contacts with people in their own country, and from time to time the ABWEA received a little material of intelligence interest. Most of it, however, was false and misleading rather than of any value. But these emigrants had some important contacts going back to the days of the First World War. At the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, Germany gave enthusiastic support to attempts at an independent Ukrainian state and agreed to the appointment as head of government of Hetman Skoropadsky, a man whose ideas centered on the creation of an autonomous Ukrainian state within Tsarist Great Russia. But in the 1920s it became obvious that this would never be achieved, and when, around 1937, the ABWEA began to consider whether to cooperate with Ukraine, Skoropadsky and his supporters were not considered. It was decided rather to develop cooperation with the armed organization of Ukrainian nationalists, its leader being Konovalets, for whom Admiral Canaris had a marked personal sympathy. Although Canaris himself was a conservative and monarchist to the core, he nevertheless preferred the revolutionary Konovalets to the aristocratic Skoropadsky. However, cooperation with Konovalets was not destined to be strengthened. Shortly after the preliminary meetings, he was assassinated while still in exile in Holland. The leadership of the organization then passed to Melnik and his main supporter, Rikko Yari, a former cadre officer in the Imperial Army. Richard Franz Marjan Yari later changed his surname to Yari. Melnik was an estate agent for the Lemberg, Lviv Greek Orthodox Metropolitan Count Sheptytsky, who was himself an officer in the Imperial Russian Army, an elderly man and a most respected figure, and he was considered the uncrowned king of the Galician Ukrainians. After the Polish campaign, the ABWEA base in Krakow came into contact with Stepan Bandera, a radical Ukrainian nationalist revolutionary who had a significant number of followers, especially among the youth in Galician Ukraine. Unfortunately, there were serious differences of opinion between Melnik and Bandera, for the former, with his greater commitment to constitutional reforms, strongly rejected the violence and radical revolutionary views of the latter. After some time, a rift developed between the two, which widened with the formation of Vlasov's military units, whose sympathies clearly leaned toward Great Russian politics. The AUN received its funding largely from Ukrainians who had emigrated to the United States and organized themselves into national associations there. In 1938, the ABWEA began military training of young Ukrainians in discrete and isolated camps on Lake Chimsy. The main emphasis was on training youth leaders in guerrilla warfare, and several groups were sent to the laboratories of the ABWEA department at Tegel near Berlin, as well as to the training center at Quensgut for instruction in the use of explosives and other materials suitable for sabotage. The Japanese were particularly interested in these attempts by the ABWEA to exploit Ukrainian and other Eastern minorities. Quite a large number of Russian immigrants, mostly Ukrainians, had settled in Manchuria and expressed a desire to cooperate with the Japanese. The atmosphere of mutual trust created by this cooperation between Germans and Ukrainians was severely tested during the resolution of the Carpathian Ukrainian problem in 1939. Notable discontent had already been caused by the arbitration in Vienna in 1938 of the dispute between rival Polish and Ukrainian claims to the territory of Carpathian Ukraine. When Hitler decided in 1939 to cede this territory to Hungary, discontent and consternation arose within the ranks of EU members. Detachments of Carpathian Ukrainians put up armed resistance to the incoming Hungarians and suffered heavy casualties, while many more were captured and imprisoned. It was Canaris who managed to transfer them to Germany, where the ABWEA took responsibility for their future provision and behavior. At the time, the General Staff was most anxious to undermine the loyalty of Ukrainians who had served in the Polish army. It was believed that the appearance of a Ukrainian volunteer corps on the German side would lead to the desertion of Ukrainians from the Polish army. Ukrainian groups trained by the ABWEA were sent to the isolated sector of Deksteinberg in eastern Slovakia, from where they were to move, when the campaign began, to the Galician sector, and then quickly infiltrate behind the Polish front into eastern Galicia, with the task of raising their compatriots for partisan warfare and destroying the communication lines of the Polish troops. It was thought that such an action would be more valuable for political and propaganda purposes than in a purely military sense, an assessment incidentally applicable to any enterprise of this kind. But all these preparations were again unsuccessful because of the change of political course. Hitler and Ribbentrop decided to give eastern Galicia to the Russians, and so the Abwehr had no choice but to remove the people most compromised among the Ukrainians by cooperation from the territory east of the San River. At the same time, at the request of the Greek Orthodox clergy, the Abwehr team moved the most valuable items of the churches in Peremyśl to the west bank of the San River shortly before the arrival of the Soviet vanguard. At the end of September 1939, the Soviet-German Friendship Treaty was signed, and the Abwehr was eventually forbidden to have any dealings with the Aun or to support it financially or in any other way. At this point, the Japanese came into play and saved the situation. As participants in the German-Japanese Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936, they were extremely concerned about the most recent turn in Soviet-German relations. The Japanese had close ties with the white emigration in Germany, which was very useful to them in conducting anti-communist propaganda and which, moreover, had converted a villa on one of Berlin's lakes into a secret printing press, through an official in their embassy. The Japanese immediately came into contact with the Ukrainians working in the Abwehr II department, took over the liaison with the Aun and D, although little is said about it, they kept in touch with the Ukrainians and kept an eye on them until as late as June 1941. Then, of course, things changed dramatically again, and the Germans were again very keen to resume the control over Ukrainian contacts that they had previously allowed themselves to lose. While the Abwehr department in Berlin was responsible for the technical side and material equipment of all operations targeting targets deep behind enemy lines, the so-called frontline duties, that is, intelligence duties on the front itself and in the immediate support areas, were under the direction of the respective army group or the army itself. To fulfill these duties, the Abwehr commands II and II of the Abwehr were placed under the command of the IS, officers of the general staff attached to the army group or the army, as the case may be, who were responsible for front reconnaissance, and when required, also units of the Brandenburg Division were similarly attached. The Abwehr headquarters was personally responsible for the available composition and equipment of these attached Abwehr commands. This double control, with Berlin in charge of the technical side and the commander-in-chief on the spot giving tactical orders, was not a good solution, and there were endless complications such as those arising from the double control of the SS and security strike, units exercised on the one hand by Himmler and on the other by the commander-in-chief in whose area these units were operating. Direct liaison with the General Staff was maintained by the headquarters of the Abwehr Commando Valley, which was located at Nikolajek and in East Prussia in close local contact with the Wolfschanze Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters, and the Army High Command. Even as the war of maneuvers on the Eastern Front crystallized into a static confrontation, gaps and poorly guarded areas could be found in almost every sector of the German and Allied fronts through which agents could be thrown. And where it was impossible or desirable to operate behind enemy lines, parachutists were used, which in the Abwehr constituted the Special Air Wing, partly recruited directly from the civilian population. Most often, however, prisoners of war were used as agents. Many Abwehr commands, taking advantage of periods of calm, at the front set up small training camps and ammunition depots where agents and saboteurs could be trained and equipped for their missions. And given the vast distances on the Eastern Front, this decentralization of the Abwehr's frontline activities was very important and proved of great value. It was universally and unanimously agreed that in using prisoners as agents the strike while the iron is hot method promised the greatest success. The sooner agents could be sent on a mission after receiving the necessary training and instruction, the better. Allowing a long period to elapse between the receipt of instructions and the commencement of action, agents, it was observed, would often sour, and then they would fail. In addition, the long wait behind the German front line inevitably gives them an opportunity to acquire a knowledge of German methods and personnel and of the personalities of their fellow agents, which, if they harbour double play schemes, may prove very dangerous. In any case, the training of several agents at the same time always carries danger. But almost all secret services are guilty of failing to observe this principle, especially in wartime, partly for lack of personnel, lack of time, or other reasons produced by war conditions, but also sometimes to keep out of trouble. The same general principle applies to the standard equipment of agents. Time and again, the base where the training was carried out is recognized by a watch or a camera or matches issued from the same supply depot. That these operations did not expand into sabotage of tactical or strategic importance, or at least created problems of considerable magnitude, must be attributed partly to professional deficiencies in the Abwehr, but mainly to the unsuccessful policy pursued by Germany in the Eastern Territories and the treatment given to national minorities in the Soviet Union. Of the many operations carried out by Brandenburg troops during the Russian campaign, the following small selection should suffice. During the offensive of Army Group North in Latvia in the summer of 1941, a unit of the Brandenburg Regiment captured a bridge over Divina River and saved it from destruction. The soldiers, disguised as wounded Russians, drove onto the bridge with the Soviet rearguard and then seized it by surprise attack. Thanks to this operation, the advance of Army Group North on Riga continued without loss of time, a success that Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal von Lieb gratefully noted in a letter to Admiral Canaris. But such attempts to mislead the enemy did not always go smoothly. In one case, during the Caucasus offensive, it was desirable to prevent the destruction of a certain dam by Soviet engineers. An advanced German lorry was about to be checked by the Commissar and its passengers. In the guise of extremely exhausted, straggling soldiers from the rearguard were about ready to climb on, as the Commissar suddenly spoke to a comrade sitting idly by the roadside. As luck would have it, it was a sergeant from Hamburg who did not know a word of Russian. Lieutenant Baron Volkersam, the commander of this Brandenburgian detachment, himself a Baltic and a descendant of the Russian Admiral Volkersam, who was killed in the Battle of Tsushima, instantly sensed the danger and with great presence of mind shouted to the Commissar, "You won't get any use out of him. He is an Armenian." Then the Commissar addressed the Armenian from Hamburg, in the language he considered his native tongue. Volkersam had nothing else to do but to take out his submachine gun and shoot the Commissar from the hip, thus signalling action. Despite this unforeseen complication, the attack ended in complete success. Such episodes occurred, of course, again and again, and to cope under such circumstances required the greatest possible presence of mind and courage. The men who were entrusted with the task of negotiating at the control posts with officers and commissioners, and of arranging for the passage of lorries ahead had to have particularly strong nerves and acumen to cope with all the unforeseen circumstances which always arise. On the presence of mind and skill of these negotiators depended not only the success of the operation in which one was engaged, but also the lives of one's comrades. In the winter of 1940-41, a battalion of former Polish soldiers of Western Ukrainian origin was assembled in the New Hammer camp near Leipzig. The companies were formed from soldiers who had received very deep military training in the Polish army and who had been selected with the help of a West Ukrainian organization from prisoners of war. Some were members of the Band Era group, while others belonged to various other Western Ukrainian organizations. The Ukrainian battalion commander was an indomitable partisan named Shkonprinka, who was later killed in 1951 while leading a Ukrainian insurgency near Kiev. The German commander was Lieutenant Albrecht Hertzner, hero of the feat at Jablonka, and Professor Oberlander was in charge of the political side. The battalion, formed by the Abwehr department, and unfortunately equipped in the most horrible way, was given the code name Nachtigall, Nightingale German, because it had its own choir which could perform on an equal footing even with the world-famous Cossack choirs. It was attached to the 1st Battalion of the Brandenburg Regiment and entered the territory of the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941. In the battle for Lviv, the patrols learned that a massacre of Ukrainians was underway in the city, and the commander of the two battalions decided to advance on Lviv himself on the night of 29 or 30 June, 7 hours before the hour of zero set for the 1st Mountain Division attack. In this battle, the Ukrainian battalion distinguished itself greatly. It occupied a radio station and from there issued an address announcing the founding of an independent Western Ukrainian state. The corpses of thousands of recently executed Ukrainian villagers were found in NKVD prisons, and besides the very spirit of freedom which inspired them, this sight strengthened their desire to fight and their ambition to throw out the Russian occupiers by force from all the territory of Ukraine. Almost immediately following this proclamation, proclaiming the proclamation of Western Ukraine, came a sharp protest from Rosenberg's department, and although the battalion again distinguished itself during the continued offensive, and especially in the battle for Vinnytsia, a gradual change of spirit began to manifest itself. The newly formed Ministry for Eastern Territories separated Western Ukraine, the districts of Peremysl and Tarnopol, from the state planned by the Ukrainian leaders, and incorporated them and their particularly resistant populations into the Governor-General's office, as the remnants of the old Polish state were now called. The result was that the Ukrainian battalion, which had encouraged tens of thousands of Western Ukrainians at Lemberg, evolved to the highest degree of readiness to fight, now became unreliable, began to revolt, and finally had to be disbanded, and thus a great potential opportunity was irretrievably lost. Captain Oberlander tried to interfere with Hitler in person, but the Führer cut short his tract by saying, "You don't know what you are saying. Russia is our Africa, and the Russians are our Negro." After this conversation, Oberlander appeared to the commander of the regiment Brandenburg and calmly stated, "This is Hitler's concept, and this is the idea because of which we will lose the war." Then, still in the department of W.R.I. Oberlander formed a battalion Bergmann, which was recruited people of Caucasian nationalities, and he rendered good service on the Caucasian front. But when the German retreat from the Caucasus began, also became unreliable. Soldiers of the Bergmann battalion under the command of Lieutenants Lange and Moritz, ejected from aeroplanes behind the Russian front, fought alongside armed Caucasian groups for about 3 months in a number of very successful guerrilla operations. During the offensive in the Caucasus, one company of the Brandenburg Regiment, using captured Soviet lorries, attached itself to a retreating Soviet column, captured and held the bridge at Maikop, helping to capture and hold what was then an important source of Soviet oil. Another unit of the regiment under the command of the same Lieutenant Baron Volkezam, who had problems with the Armenian from Hamburg, snuck across the Russian lines disguised as Soviet soldiers and operated very successfully for several weeks behind the Russian front line, captured the headquarters of an entire division unharmed, and then returned safely to their German side. The Ukrainians were by no means the only people whose cooperation was possible in the fight against the Russians. Even before the Russian campaign, the border Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were very keen to exchange intelligence information and to conduct their intelligence activities with Germany generally according to mutually agreed principles. It was also a terrible disappointment to these nations when Hitler reversed his policy and left their fate to the Russians. The German minority migrated from the Baltic states, and the Abwehr officer saw the people who had worked with him in the past as an opportunity to escape the Russian claws. Even so, past cooperation bore fruit during the war against the Soviet Union, as we shall see from the following report of a German officer. Before the beginning of the Russian campaign, there were many young Estonians in Finland, some of whom had fought on the side of the Finns as volunteers in the Winter War of 1939–1940, while others had fled by boat or made their way on foot across the ice of the Gulf of Finland after the occupation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union. Many of them hoped that they would live to see their country liberated and sought ways to facilitate this. To utilize these forces, a few well-known Estonian officers who had found refuge in Germany were sent to Finland to select and train young Estonians for service that would be carried out purely in the Estonian national interest. At the same time, the German intelligence offices were particularly interested in intelligence reports from Estonian territory, and it was therefore decided to request volunteers suitable for intelligence work. The Finns cooperated enthusiastically. Training sites were allocated on the Soko Peninsula some 25 miles west of Helsinki. Radio communication instructors were provided, and a special radio headquarters was set up to deal with information when the organization later became operational. Estonian volunteers were issued uniforms and given the status of foreign volunteers in the German Wehrmacht. When the Russian campaign began on 21 June, and the initial successes of the Germans predicted a quick occupation of Estonia, it was necessary to take swift action. About 80 volunteers were assembled and equipped. They were given a final briefing and sent to the island of Pelinge to learn the elements of seamanship. Transport in the form of 2 patrol ships, motorboats and single-masted fishing boats was provided by the Finnish Navy, which also took a keen interest in the operation. Factors had to be taken into account in planning the transport. The extreme brevity of summer nights in these northern latitudes, the use of ships of 3 different speeds, fast motorboats, medium-speed patrol ships, and slow fishing boats. The restriction imposed on the use of motorboats on the high seas, and the need for all these different speed ships to arrive at their destination at the same time, and at a time that would allow these ships to be out of range of Soviet shore bats on the return trip. To cope with these factors, it was decided to divide the ships into 3 groups, departing at precisely timed intervals, with the fishing boats first, the motorboats in the middle, and the patrol ships in the tail. A cape in Kumna Bay was designated as the assembly point, from where 2 motorboats with an advance guard of commandos under 2 German officers would proceed to the chosen landing place and, if necessary and possible, establish a bridgehead there. Only when all this was done would the fishing boats with the main group approach the shore, while the 2 patrol ships remained on guard at the entrance to the bay. The first attempt was made on the 5th of July, but it failed on account of the rough sea, which flooded nearly all the boats. The next attempt on the 7th of July finally succeeded partially, though it started very badly. On the way back, the ships came across a Soviet caravan with a strong convoy. The leading group on motorboats managed to slip away from the convoy undetected, but then turned 180 degrees, for they came to the conclusion that the presence of the convoy automatically cancels the entire operation. The group of fishing boats was thrown off course by the convoy, and then, because of a navigator's error, headed for Loksa Bay instead of Kumna Bay. Here this group was attacked by a light Soviet patrol ship and then retreated. From a group of patrol ships that also came across the convoy, the Russians demanded by signalling that they belonged. The group immediately rushed west, letting the convoy pass her on an easterly course, and then returned to its former course in the keel of this convoy, but found that the other groups had not yet arrived. The commander of the whole expedition decided, against all odds, to enter the bay, and without further defence land his detachment, consisting of about 40 men under the command of an Estonian colonel. This operation was carried out without incident. On 10 July a 3rd attempt was made to land the remaining 40 men and 2 German officers. However, while crossing the Gulf of Finland, the ships were fired upon by Red Fleet artillery and forced to retreat. As a result of this incident, it was to be assumed that the Russian Coast Guard was now on full alert and would take measures to repel any attempt to land such a landing. And it was therefore decided to abandon attempts to send any further force by sea. In the meantime, radio contact had been made with the first landing party, and it was agreed how to organize on the ground to receive reinforcements to be dropped from the air. Having flown out in one Mi-1111 U-52, the remainder of the group descended safely by parachute. Assignments for this group were set by the 18th Army, and that army was more interested in information gathering than in sabotage. The latter was indeed viewed with disapproval because the army hoped to capture the installations nor did the army show much enthusiasm for guerrilla warfare, in which the cost in casualties was thought to outweigh all proportion to the gains. Meanwhile, the groups that had settled inside Estonia split, partly according to plan and partly because of the actions of the Russians. One group quickly made contact with the German troops advancing from the west, and was able to give much valuable information about this section of the theatre, which it had already reconnoitred. Another group, operating in the countryside, came across a large group of so-called Estonian forest brothers, people who were hiding in the forests for fear of deportation or arrest. During the last phase of the operation, this group of brothers, under the command of Estonian Colonel Lee Tamil, was supplied by air with food, medicines, weapons, etc. In this way, temporary contact was established with 5 independent groups, which reported their reconnaissance results by radio, and their further tactical activities were managed by headquarters in consultation with the respective army group. One group was moving from the Akivi-Jedu area towards Revel, and on the way sent its reports of enemy reinforcements moving in that area. Another group dropped by parachute west of Wesenberg, headed for Narva and quickly established communication with the German 16th Army, which was advancing to capture that city. The third group carried out reconnaissance in the area of Wesenberg, with the special task of staying close to the Red Army Group Command and reporting on its movements. Despite the rapidity of the movement, the flow of reports continued without interruption, and the work done earned high praise from the army. This was probably the first and perhaps the only time such reconnaissance work was carried out on the German side on such a large scale. The casualties were relatively small. All groups managed to make their way back behind the German front line, and most of these men then volunteered for service in the Wehrmacht, Eventually, two groups of the same unit, whose homes were in Ocel, were dropped by parachute, and they too fulfilled their assigned task. Operation Erna, as it was then called, which was seen by the Germans as a battlefield reconnaissance, took on a completely different meaning in the eyes of the Estonian people. Many of its participants returned to their homes after the operation was over, where they did not hesitate to tell everyone about their experience. The story could not be kept secret, and very soon it became known to all Estonians. Due to the fact that the operation was carried out under German leadership, and that Estonians were given the privilege to speak for their fatherland and strike the first blow in the struggle for liberation, the command staff and especially the commander himself earned great respect and trust in Estonian nationalist circles. These facts were sacredly preserved when later, out of considerations of high German policy, the formation of Estonian units was refused on the grounds that it was undesirable to allow Estonians to participate in the liberation of their country, and thus give them the legal right to demand recognition of their services. The trust in the German commander of Operation Erna never faded, and was of great importance when, as a result of the utterly unthinkable policy of the German civil administration, Estonia was gradually alienated from the race. The German commander, for his part, never deceived the confidence of the Estonians and was never the cause of disappointment to the Estonian people. Despite all the strenuous efforts of Soviet intelligence to seal their country, there were still a number of sources throughout the war who were able to receive reports from Russia itself, or who, at any rate, claimed to be able to do so. Perhaps the most surprising case occurred with an agent working under the alias Klatt. At the beginning of the war, the Abwehr office in Vienna had at its disposal a large group of excellent agents who had settled in the southeast of Europe. Very few of them were Jews or persons of Jewish origin, and it was only with the greatest difficulty that the head of the department, Count Mironja Redwitz, managed to protect his staff from the cruel and unfriendly attention of the party machine. But he succeeded, and for a very long time at that. By far the best agent was a man named Klatt, who himself said that he was half Jewish. Klatt's material on the Soviet Union was first-rate and sometimes sensational. His sources of information, on the other hand, remained shrouded in a veil of anonymity until the very end. As long as he could remain in Sofia, he claimed that his information came by radio direct from Russia, where, he assured us, he had an employee in the radio department in the Kremlin itself. But these assurances of his did not stand up to scrutiny. On the days when he claimed to have received messages from Russia, the radio listening service could prove that there was no radio communication at all. Nor could he substantiate his claim that he was receiving information directly from the Soviet embassy in Sofia. But Klatt managed to survive even these crises in his career, for the Supreme Headquarters repeatedly confirmed the superior value of his reports. About 1943, he moved the arena of his activities to Bucharest, where he continued his practice. Again and again he claimed to have terrific sources of information, but again none of them were ever confirmed. When Admiral Canaris was dismissed from his post in February 1944, Klatt's position in view of the new arrangement within German intelligence became seemingly intolerable. But again this remarkably intelligent man survived, not least because of the fact that he could claim with all fairness that the material he was supplying was simply incomparable. At the end of 1944, determined to get to the truth once and for all, the chief of the War Bureau of the 6th Security Directorate launched a formal investigation into Klatt's activities. And with this, two groups of Abwehr officers found themselves in sharp opposition to each other. One group defended Klatt, while the other said that he must be a Russian agent and was being used to plant false information in German intelligence. Of course, some of this information was true, they said, for it was the only way the Russians could convince the German High Command that Klatt was a real agent. But when the time came, the Russians would set a real trap for the Germans through Klatt. Schellenberg, who never liked to make decisions on his own responsibility, went to the Chief of the Army General Staff, General Guderian, and asked him whether the General Staff could do without the information extracted by Klatt. At that, he pulled out several of Klatt's reports and showed them to the General. Guderian was already well acquainted with these reports and officially told Schellenberg that closing this source would be an act of criminal irresponsibility, and that Klatt's reports, especially on the Red Air Force, were simply unique. He added that there were no other agents who even approached Klatt in value. This had probably saved Klatt. But now the Vienna office to which he was subordinate decided to take his contacts into its own hands, and for this purpose it attached a lieutenant to Klatt's office. This lieutenant apparently quickly got to the bottom of what was going on, but how much he revealed is difficult to say. Early in 1945, however, he reported that he had gained complete control of Klatt's sources, and Klatt was thereupon dismissed and placed in the hands of the Gestapo in Vienna. The assumption that Klatt was actually a Soviet spy was soon disproved, for as the Soviet armies approached Vienna, he did his best to get out of the city, even at the risk of ending up in a concentration camp somewhere to the west. In March 1945, he approached an old captain in the Vienna branch of the Abwehr, begging him to intervene and somehow get him out before the Russians took the city. One of Schellenberg's officers, incidentally without consulting the chief, agreed that Klatt should be taken somewhere to the west. At the same time, he secretly ordered the officer who was to accompany Klatt to allow the latter to escape on the way. To show his gratitude, Klatt sent his benefactor the following letter. Within the next few days, a gentleman of Japanese appearance will arrive at Aspany Aerodrome on his way to Sweden. Using the password, make contact with him and arrange for him to send his material in future, not to Klatt, but to any other recipient you may choose. No contact was made with the Japanese man in question, but it is almost certain that he was some well-known Japanese journalist who had been working for the Japanese intelligence service for many years. Those who have been involved in the case of this mysterious spy now consider it possible that Klatt and the Japanese journalist were acquainted with each other through their work in the Balkans for many years. The Japanese received the most splendid intelligence about the Soviet Union from Moscow, which probably came from Turkey. It was bought from him by Klatt and forwarded to the Abwehr as his own. Klatt was forced to lie about his sources of information because he thought that if he revealed the truth, he would simply be sacked. He was able to pay his informant well, because not only did he have a considerable amount of money in dollars, but he was also involved in large-scale currency transactions that earned him a very good income. He did pay for the information he received. This is proved by the fact that when he disclosed the source of the information, he meaningfully stated that the new recipient of the reports must from that moment on assume financial responsibility for payment. As Schellenberg later told his cellmate, he himself believed that this version was correct, and in support of his opinion he cited examples in which Klatt's reports were very similar to the official reports of the Japanese embassy. The full story of this uniquely interesting agent will probably never be known, but the value of his reports was very highly regarded by such authorities as Morona, Canaris, Schellenberg and Guderian, and they must have been of very great importance. Needless to say, Soviet intelligence did not sit idle in Germany both before and during the war. German counterintelligence had to keep its eyes open. The most impressive case, already discussed in Chapter 5, was known as the Red Chapel. This was the code name the Abwehr gave to the large Soviet intelligence network inside Germany, in the occupied territories, and in such neutral countries as Sweden and even Switzerland. Although the Abwehr was, of course, well aware that the Russians had had agents inside Germany for years, and although masses of Soviet agents were continuously parachuted into the eastern territories where, because of poor training, they were usually apprehended almost immediately, the scope and extent of their masterly espionage activities came as a stunning surprise. After weeks and months of continuous, meticulous and invisible work, which consisted of an enormous amount of counter-intelligence measures, the Abwehr finally succeeded in seizing a Soviet shortwave transmitter in Brussels on the night of 12 December 1941. This provided the key to what was thought to be the Russians' main spy network, although its threads did not become firmly in the Abwehr's possession until after a second transmitter had been captured, also in Brussels. These threads led to some staggering places: the Ministry of Aviation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Economics. In all of them, and especially in the Ministry of Aviation, there were Russian agents, Germans. Of course, mostly communists, working specifically for the Russians as spies, not just enemies of the Nazi regime. There were second-ranking officials and junior officers. Canaris's suspicion that even a bigger fish like Bormann was involved was never confirmed, but the value of the information they could pass on to Moscow was enormous. They operated for several years under the very noses of the Gestapo and the German internal security services, and, were it not for the technical brilliance of the Abwehr radio direction finders in Brussels, they might never have been caught. Ideological traitors, who of course did not consider themselves such, are very slippery fish indeed, as the revelations in the Anglo-Saxon countries after the war showed. It was reported that 78 men and women were executed for their participation in the Red Chapel. This figure, however, is not considered reliable, as other sources bring it up to 400. Its exposure, though incomplete, was perhaps the most powerful blow of Abwehr Itor, and it can surely be counted among its most impressive achievements. The history of this event is as follows. Prior to the outbreak of hostilities between Germany and the Soviet Union, the Soviet spy organization in Germany and the German-occupied territories had been very quiet. However, in the summer of 1941, the German Radio Control Service in Berlin reported to the Abwehr office in Brussels that a shortwave radio station was being broadcast every night. The transmitter was believed to be somewhere near the Belgian coast. The agents searched unsuccessfully for its location, and finally the Radio Direction Finding Company of the Abwehr, reinforced by a radio direction finding platoon from the Berlin police, got involved. It soon became clear that the transmitter was actually in Brussels. The search was thus narrowed down, and with the help of new precision direction finders, the so-called configurate, a house on the Rue Etrebat was identified. At midnight, between 12 and 13 December 1941, an impressive squad of police officers, equipped with wire cutters, lockpicks and other such tools, suddenly broke into the house. 2 adjoining houses were occupied at the same time. Nothing suspicious was found in them. But a policeman noticed a man climbing over the garden wall at the back of the yard. He was soon apprehended. Meanwhile, in the central house, the police entered a small, brightly lit room on the ground floor. Here they found a radio transmitter switched on, ready to transmit a message, a sure sign that the radio operator had been taken by surprise while at work. Next to the machine lay various coded messages and work instructions. Preliminary questioning of the captured man revealed that he was a Soviet lieutenant, but it proved impossible to decipher the messages. A woman was arrested in the same house who, according to documents in her possession, was a Parisian. She refused to answer any questions, but a search of her room revealed a secret door, behind which the police discovered a workshop fully equipped for the production of false papers and documents, both civil and military. Another woman was arrested in the same house. She was a Jewish woman named Vera. A victim of racial persecution and family tragedy, she had fallen into the clutches of Soviet agents. Certain information was obtained from her. In particular, she said that the 2 passport-type photographs found in this workshop of false documents were those of the big chief and the little chief, but who they were, she could not say. The Soviet Secret Service never allowed its agents to know anything about their leaders. Among the papers seized were detailed instructions on how to use the transmitter along with a description of the equipment, all in German. There were also some postal maps with views of various German cities, particularly Berlin, Nuremberg, Augsburg and Hamburg. Abwehr RIEF, which was responsible for combating foreign espionage, concluded that German citizens, if not German officials, were united in an espionage organization. This suspicion of treachery was strengthened by Vera's statement that people who visited the house spoke German. This, as can be imagined, led to serious perturbations at the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin. In the spring of 1942, news came from Berlin that a new transmitter, possibly also located in Brussels and operating on the same frequency as the first, was again sending messages to Moscow. As with the first captured device, transmissions were made between midnight and 5 am using direction finders. This radio station was also detected. On the night of 19-20 May, field police broke into a house. There they found the transmitter on the ground floor, but the room was empty. The radio operator had fled. However, policemen posted outside saw the man fleeing along the roof. On reaching the last row of houses, he jumped onto the glass roof. After a brief search, he was found hiding in the basement. Under interrogation, he confessed that his name was Wilhelm Schwarz, that he came from Königsberg, East Prussia, and that he had been a leading worker in the German Communist Party until 1934. Police records confirmed this statement. Schwarz was on the wanted list. He travelled to Moscow in 1934, where he received training for his work in Belgium. In his suitcase, the investigator found fresh reports in encrypted form, and a numerical code was used. He also received unencrypted messages in German. One had a complete Berlin address. Others clearly contained detailed information concerning upcoming German combat operations at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus. operations which, incidentally, did not begin until the end of the following month. On these papers was a note that they must never fall into German hands, for only 4 men in the highest German military positions knew of these plans, so that the loss of these documents should immediately compromise the source. The captured documents were sent by aeroplane to Berlin. At a short meeting at Admiral Canaris's office, it was decided to inform the commanders of the branches of the armed forces. It turned out that the Berlin address belonged to a Luftwaffe officer. It was Lieutenant Schulz Boysen, who worked in the headquarters task force in the attached department at OKW. Shortly before the Nazis came to power, Schulz Boysen had contacted a stenographer who was under police suspicion for political reasons. However, nothing substantial was found against him. Then, through his fiancée, the granddaughter of Prince Eulenburg, he managed to establish contact with Göring, who was impressed by the lieutenant's abilities. He became a lecturer on political matters. This enabled him to make the acquaintance of many young men who fell captive to his attractive and pleasant mannerisms. His unusual lifestyle attracted others. When the war broke out, he managed to get 2 of his young men into the cipher section. By duty, these 2 received first-hand knowledge of the workings of foreign secret services. They passed on to Schulz Boysen everything of interest, and he forwarded all the vital information thus acquired to the Russians. When the 2 young men learnt of the revelations in Brussels, one of them immediately informed Schulz Boysen by telephone. He immediately collected all the compromising material he could and successfully arranged for its transfer to a safe house in Stockholm. He kept in contact with his men through a secret line to the cipher section. This line was connected to a telephone in an empty office. Unaware that this office had recently been occupied by some officer, Schulz Boysen called the number. The officer answered. Schulz Boysen immediately apologized, saying he had dialed the wrong number, but the officer's suspicions were aroused. He wrote a report. A shadow fell over the young men, and they were arrested the next time they met Schulz Boysen, as was he. A Foreign Office official who was actively working for Soviet intelligence was also identified and arrested. Finally, a considerable number of short-wave transmitters were found in various German cities. Through information supplied by Vera in Brussels, the Abwehr came on the trail of a firm run by the Little Chief which did business with German service organizations. It was alleged that the Little Chief was a Portuguese man named Vincenz Corella. He was in the import-export business, had contracts to supply goods for the Wehrmacht in Belgium, and was thus authorized to use international telephone, telegraph and postal services. He could therefore make calls to subscribers in neutral countries. He was also endowed with the right to visit Denmark and Czechoslovakia on business. It was later discovered that the Little Chief was a Soviet captain. Meanwhile, the search for the Big Chief continued. With Vera's help, a master document forger and his mistress were arrested. The master was believed to be in contact with the Big Chief. This forger, known as the Maker, turned out to be a criminal. His only interest was to make as much money as possible with his craftsmanship, regardless of the purpose for which his forgeries were required. The field police therefore offered him a handsome sum for betraying his former employer. He accepted the offer without hesitation. His first action was to write a letter to one alleged rubber trader with whom he had previously had an affair. In this letter he apologized for his absence at the last meeting and offered to meet again. This letter was given to the mistress of the manufacturer. 2 days later, a reply was sent inviting him to meet at a market in Brussels, but the rubber trader did not turn up for either this or the next meeting. The Belgian policeman, whom the Abwehr trusted, also enjoyed the confidence of the Soviet spies. One day the manufacturer approached this policeman with a request to supply him with blank forms of identity cards which he had at work. The policeman, in consultation with the Abwehr, agreed to fulfill the request, but insisted that he be given photographs of the persons for whom the identity cards were intended. The first photograph was handed over at once. He took it to the Abwehr, where it was retaken before returning the forged identity card to the policeman. It showed a hitherto unknown blonde-haired young man of about 25 to 30 years of age. Although this person was also unknown to other German police authorities, the Maker claimed to be the new head of the Soviet spy organization in Brussels. The Belgian policeman now informed the Maker that he would give the false identity card only to the genuine person to whom it belonged, and suggested a place to meet. Strangely enough, the Maker agreed to this. The young man turned up at the appointed place and time and was arrested, but flatly refused to answer any questions about himself or his contact. Radist Schwartz, however, maintained that the young man was indeed the Brussels-based head of the Soviet Secret Service. Meanwhile, the search for the big chief continued and a new thread was being unwound. Fabricator reported that the alarmed Brussels spies had fled to Paris. Then the Abwehr began surveillance of persons who visited German institutions in that city. Soon their attention was drawn to a building on the Champs-Élysées, which housed the administrative headquarters of Tott's organization. People were entering and leaving here without any effective security check. A firm in Brussels was found to have regular dealings with Tott's organization. A Wehrmacht liaison officer knew from his appearance the head of this firm. When he was shown a photograph of the wanted man believed to be the big chief, he confirmed that this man was indeed the head of the firm. Thus, the Abwehr was already following on the heels of the big chief. However, it quickly became apparent that the liaison officer had no record of the man's address. All attempts to find out the address were unsuccessful, and the case did not move forward until an employee of a Brussels firm suddenly told him that his boss had asked him a few days ago to recommend a dentist and was going to go to him for treatment. The man had an appointment for treatment a few days later. He was indeed arrested in the dentist's chair, but at interrogations he refused to give his real name, and persisting in his refusal, he remained unknown and was addressed as Big Chief. He admitted that he had been born in the Russian part of Poland. He spoke excellent German, English, and French in addition to his mother tongue and had been carrying out secret missions abroad for the Russians since 1925 or 1926. Over time, data on some of his active fellow spies began to gradually come to light through him. This was achieved by his being released more or less quickly and allowed to move about undisturbed but under the constant supervision of 2 agents. Due to the negligence of his guards, he managed to escape. They were ordered to stay close to him at all times, and one day one guard agreed to go with him to a drugstore where he wanted to buy something. The place was full of people, and the big chief suddenly disappeared into the crowd. All attempts to catch him were unsuccessful. Thanks to the captured transmitters and already cracked codes, the Abwehr managed to maintain contact with Moscow for some time. This proved to be a most useful source of information. The Abwehr was even fortunate enough to ask Moscow for money in English currency, ostensibly to pay the agents, and at the appointed time the money arrived via Sofia. But, of course, this game could not be played for long. In the meantime, the struggle to destroy the Red Chapel with its many tentacles spread throughout Europe continued. It never came to an end, and there can be no doubt that the same organization, perhaps in some cases using the same people, is still active today. I was referring to German attempts, while the Russians were their allies, to sow enmity between the Soviets and Britain and France in Western Asia. Nothing came of that. But during the same period, the prospects of causing trouble to the British in India and Afghanistan were discussed with them. Here, too, the Russians proved more ready to cooperate. But, while approving the German idea, they themselves refused to play any part in plans to foment unrest in these areas. The first target was Afghanistan, the long-standing thorn in the side of the British Raj, and the object was to overthrow the pro-British king and restore Amanullah, then in exile in Rome, to his lost throne. If such a plan had succeeded, it would undoubtedly have led to serious unrest in India, especially among the inhabitants of Waziristan, Mohmand, Afridiyas, and other tribes of the northwest frontier province. The first steps towards the realization of these plans were to be taken by Haji Mirza Ali Khan, the fakir of IPA. The National Socialist Party at first enthusiastically supported the idea, and its representative in the planning apparatus of the Abwehr was at that time a certain Habicht, who played a prominent part in Austrian affairs. Soon, however, political difficulties began to be felt. Molotov rethought the situation. He decided that the Afghan adventure did not fit into Soviet policy, especially when he thought that the Soviet Union might be asked to supply arms and ammunition, which it should not. On the German side, Rosenberg also viewed the Sino-Soviet rapprochement with misgivings. And since the Foreign Office and Canaris were also more skeptical of Habicht's Indian fairy tales, the original large-scale plan was abandoned. But the plan to foment unrest among anti-British tribes in the northwest frontier province continued to be carried out by the Abwehr, regardless of the Afghan question. In 1938, the fakir of IP gave the British a lot of headaches. The British bombed villages where they suspected he and his supporters lived and sent 2 punitive expeditions against him. By means of artificially induced landslides, ambushes in inaccessible rocks and the like, at which these mountaineers were great experts, they were able to successfully defend themselves against the British. During the war, contact with Fakir of IP had been maintained through the Italian consul in Kabul. But now the Abwehr was interested in establishing direct communication with him. A scientist of international repute, well acquainted with previous expeditions to that country and its people, was sent. This expedition, however, ended tragically, for the German emissary was shot dead by the Afghan gendarmes and his companion disappeared, badly wounded, before they reached their destination. Then the Afghans announced that they had mistaken these foreigners, dressed in the local manner, for Amanullah's emissaries, of an Indian sepai where he was cooking food. The latter had to throw his food away without even touching it. Once a Sikh, determined to act in the spirit of modernity, allowed his long hair and beard to be shorn off. The same night he was shot in his sleep by his Sikh brothers. The German commander, an Austrian by birth, argued that it was necessary to accept the explanation of this accident as a suicide, as he realized that any investigation into this crime of religious fanaticism would be misunderstood by the Sikhs. During military training, commands were given in German, but instructions were given in English, the language of communication for all Indian soldiers in the British Indian Army. Indian soldiers were particularly skilled in hand-to-hand combat, and as scouts and the warlike Sikhs, who were always favoured by the British both in the army and in police service, had all the marvellous qualities required to make them fit into the German military system. Subhas Chandra Bose took the utmost interest in the military training of his supporters. Selected men were attached to the Abwehr for training in subversion and sabotage, while the Germans still cherished dreams of a breakthrough to the Caucasus and even the Persian Gulf. They had the intention of sending the Indian Legion by air to initiate a widespread revolt in India, but Bose insisted that his cooperation in the liberation of India must depend on the world situation. In his sober analysis of possibilities, he resembled Admiral Canaris. The latter was aware that Bose never spoke out rashly, and he valued him most for this quality. Bose was no collaborator in the bad sense of the word as it had acquired in recent years. Rather, he was a true Indian patriot with a single-minded idea, who was going to do nothing for Germany but everything and anything, including the furtherance of German interests for India. In the late autumn of 1942, he told Canaris, "You know as well as I do that Germany cannot win this war. But this time a victorious Britain will lose India. Even the British will not be able to break their promise to relinquish their dominion over India, which they willingly made in 1940. When Bose realized that Germany had nothing more to offer him in the way of an advance base in any of its theatres of operations as part of his struggle for the liberation of India, he came into contact with the Japanese, who could be of more assistance to him in carrying out his political plans. Japanese Ambassador Oshima received reluctant consent from the German authorities for Bose's departure. In February 1943, he boarded the German submarine U-190 and transferred to a Japanese submarine in the middle of the Indian Ocean. From Japan, he travelled to Burma, and in June 1943, he crossed the Indo-Burma border with a small Indian Liberation Army and a few Japanese units. After the collapse of Germany, he was still fighting a jungle war against the British. According to the official report, he crashed while flying over Formosa to Japan in a Japanese warplane. There were later reports that he was now in China, but they are probably not credible. After his departure, Bose's supporters in Germany found themselves without a leader. Between 1944 and 1945, they were used in air defense units, and as coastal patrols on quiet sections of the Western Front. Some of them eventually managed to return to India, and when Indian Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru ceremonially raised the flag of independent India in New Delhi in August 1947. Among the many Indian soldiers present were several former comrades, in arms of nationalist leader Subhas Chandra Bose. The increasing intensity of economic warfare in the Atlantic and its extension to all seas, including Antarctica, led in the spring of 1940 to an exploration of the possibility of attacking the enemy war economy in the Pacific. Japanese sources were reporting that tungsten and other strategically important raw materials were being shipped in increasing quantities from East Asian ports to British and neutral country ships bound for Britain. Among the most active ports were Shanghai, Canton, Manila, and those in British possessions on the Malacca Peninsula. Attempts to strike at this trade by submarines operating off the African coast were generally unsuccessful. To reach the Chinese seas was beyond the capabilities of German submarines, as their range was insufficient for such distant operations. But in those years, when Germany still maintained friendly relations with the Soviet Union, a very tempting route for sending raiders' ships attacking a convoy into the Pacific was the Northeast Passage through the Bering Strait into the vast open Pacific. The favourable Japanese position supported the feasibility of this plan, for the successful execution of which there were two prerequisites. The raiders must pass through the Northeast Passage completely camouflaged and undetected. And second, once in these places, they must be adequately supported in the Pacific and constantly supplied with information on the changing maritime trade routes in connection with the war situation, on the density of enemy shipping in the various regions, and on the various aviation and radio security measures, prima facie, of the enemy's shipping in the Pacific, and on the various security measures in the Pacific. Before the outbreak of war, a trial liaison between the Abwehr and Japanese naval intelligence was established at the insistence of Admiral Canaris, but the general world situation in the 1930s was such that it seemed unlikely that Germany would be able to wage cruiser warfare against merchant ships in the Pacific for the foreseeable future. Now, however, the German intelligence service was to settle on the Asian continent as soon as possible, and there organize a comprehensive reconnaissance in the Pacific. Accordingly, a commission was given to an Abwehr officer with instructions to urgently organize an intelligence network in Pacific ports, from which continuous and timely information on ship movements could be sent through the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin to the General Command of the Navy. In this connection, partly out of respect for Japanese neutrality, and partly because of the growing tension between Japan and the United States, and in order not to incriminate Japan in helping Germany in the war in the Pacific, the Japanese secret services should not be involved. When asked who he wanted to entrust with the task of creating a Far Eastern intelligence service in the midst of war, and in the face of the extremely difficult political situation in the Far East, Admiral Canaris chose a former sailor of the First World War, although he never served in the Far East. He was engaged in business in the Middle East, and proved to be just the right person who is able to cope with an exceptional task in exceptional circumstances. The choice proved to be a most fortunate one. This officer gave the following account of his activities. For the establishment of an intelligence network, the heterogeneous four-zone city of Shanghai proved to be an ideal location. It concentrated maritime transport interests of great magnitude and importance. Even in wartime, ships of every flag flying on the world's oceans found their way to Shanghai. For in Shanghai they could acquire everything they needed in terms of food, repair services, and equipment. In addition, the population of the city included people of almost every nation, and this suggested a particularly wide range in the selection of agents suitable for receiving and transmitting information. The most fertile ground for an intelligence officer's purposes is represented by the International Quarter concession, which forms the center of the city, and the Japanese, Chinese and French quarters, since the Shanghai French are mostly supporters of the Vichy government. On the other hand, the very heterogeneity of the city compels the intelligence officer to extreme caution and requires him to exercise sound judgment of human nature, and the ability to discern why any particular agent has offered his services. In this case, we were able in a comparatively short period of time to reconnoitre and almost completely cover all shipping on the Wampu and Yangtze. But long-distance radio communication from Shanghai to Berlin was at first fraught with many technical difficulties. In accordance with a pre-arranged plan, a first-class radio operator was dispatched at the request of the Abwehr headquarters. Because of his cover legend, he could not carry the equipment with him, and when at last the valuable devices arrived in Shanghai, they were smashed to pieces on the road. At first we tried to find the necessary spare parts in the local market, but again we had to proceed with extreme caution, lest the enemy secret services should get even a remote idea of the nature of our activities. In the end we had to ask Berlin to send the most important of the parts, and they came in normal condition. But during this time we lost the results of a whole month's activity through lack of means of communication. As soon as communication with the Abwehr-Belzig branch was established, it worked completely smoothly and proved to be able to cope with the ever-increasing workload, and was, moreover, a clear source of satisfaction to all concerned. Expansion of our sphere of exploration required new bases, for example at Tianjin and Canton, and, if possible, to penetrate the maritime transport activities of the Philippines and around the coast of Australia. The places on which we then concentrated our efforts were Tianjin and Qingdao, and in both we were able to organize an effective intelligence service in direct and continuous communication with Shanghai. Intelligence in the ports along the coast of South China proved a much more difficult task. Any infiltration and surveillance of trade and shipping from Canton, Hong Kong and other such ports was particularly difficult. It was impossible for a German intelligence officer to visit them personally because the Sino-Japanese conflict cut the land routes, and since a British cruiser had stopped a Japanese liner on the high seas between San Francisco and Kobe and removed a number of German passengers of draft age from it, passage on Japanese ships was forbidden. The intelligence communication between Shanghai and Canton could thus only be organized on a limited scale and through intermediaries. Much information received in this way from Canton proved to be rendered worthless by the inevitable delay in its transmission. To remedy the situation, I decided to try to reach Canton myself by way of Nanking in spite of the war. But I was forced to abandon this attempt before reaching Nanking, as the Japanese military authorities would not tolerate the presence of any foreigner in a war zone. Alas, it was impossible for me to change into Chinese clothes. My skin was not the same color, and my eyes were not the same shape. Looking back, I feel satisfied that the information sent by our organization to the Supreme Naval Command made a significant contribution to the damage done to enemy shipping in the Pacific. Thanks to us, the auxiliary cruiser, which successfully passed through the Northeast Passage, received timely information of important developments in the Pacific, and was able, among other things, to slip undetected through enemy communications and lay minefields near various Australian ports, which caused great damage to the enemy's shipping and very effective disruption of his normal shipping schedules. Our observation of the enemy's methods of shipping in the Pacific has also given us valuable insights which have enabled us to arrive at conclusions about the convoy system used in the Atlantic and the methods of concentrating convoys near the African coast. In the Pacific, ships usually sailed autonomously and travelled to pre-arranged rendezvous points, where convoys were formed for onward travel to the British Isles. Thus, the Shanghai branch performed a service whose effectiveness affected even submarine warfare in the Atlantic Ocean. The outbreak of war between Japan and the United States in December 1941 put an end to the work of the Shanghai office as far as German naval operations in the Pacific were concerned. But the branch, which by the end of 1941 had expanded very markedly, continued to function with a new staff and with new tasks, dictated by the changed conditions, practically to the very end of the war.